11th, and welcome to our Srimad-Bhagavatam class hosted by ISKCON Dublin. As ever, we will start chanting a little Jai Radha Madhava, the bhajan hymn or song that Srila Prabhupada always chanted before giving Srimad-Bhagavatam class. Jai. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. A reading from Srimad-Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 13, Dhritarashtra quits home. Text today 51, but we will do a couple of texts actually, because there is no purport, I think, to some of these. I'm just noticing that my camera is slipping and looking a little crooked. Okay, see if that sticks. Okay, so a reading from Srimad-Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 13, Dhritarashtra quits home. And we have text 51. We'll read the Sanskrit actually of text 61. Dhritarashtra saha bratra Gandharya cha swabharyaya Dakshinena himavata Rishinam ashramam gata Dhritarashtra Sahabhatra Gandharya cha Swabharyaya Dakshinena Himavata Rishinam Ashramam Gata Dhritarashtra Sahabhatra Gandharya cha Swabharyaya Dakshinena Himavata Rishinam Ashramam Gata Dhritarashtra Sahabhatra Gandharya cha Swabharyaya Dakshinena Himavata Rishinam Ashramam Gata. Translation. O king, your uncle Dhritarashtra, his brother Vidura and his wife Gandhari have gone to the southern side of the Himalaya mountains, where there are shelters of the great sages. Purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. To pacify the mourning, Maharaj Yudhisthira, I'll read that again. To pacify the mourning Maharaj Yudhisthira, Narada first of all spoke from the philosophical point of view, and then he began to describe the future movements of his uncle, which he could see by his foreseeing powers, and thus began to describe as follows. Text 52. The place is called Saptashrota, divided by 7, because the waters there of the sacred Ganges were divided into 7 branches. This was done for the satisfaction of the 7 great rishis. And then the last one, text 53. On the banks at Saptashrota, Dhritarashtra is now engaged in beginning Astanga Yoga by bathing 3 times daily, in the morning, noon and evening, by performing the Agnihotra sacrifice with fire and by drinking only water. This helps one control the mind and the senses and frees one completely from thoughts of familial affection. Purport, again by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. The yoga system is a mechanical way to control the senses and the mind and divert them from matter to spirit. The preliminary processes are the sitting posture, meditation, spiritual thoughts, manipulation of air passing within the body, gradual situation in trance, and facing the absolute person, Paramatma. Such mechanical ways of rising to the spiritual platform prescribe some regulative principles of taking bath daily 3 times, fasting as far as possible, sitting and concentrating the mind on spiritual matters, and thus gradually becoming free from Vishaya or material objectives. Material existence means to be absorbed in the material objective, which is simply illusory. House, country, family, society, children, property, and business are some of the material coverings of the spirit, Atma, and the yoga system helps one to become free from all these illusory thoughts and gradually turn towards the absolute person, Paramatma. By material association and education, we learn simply to concentrate on flimsy things. But yoga is the process of forgetting them altogether. Modern so-called yogis and yoga systems manifest some magical feats, and ignorant persons are attracted by such false things, or they accept the yoga system as a cheap healing process for diseases of the gross body. But factually, the yoga system is the process of learning to forget what we have acquired throughout the struggle for existence. Dhritarashtra was all along engaged in improving family affairs by raising the standard of living of his sons, or by usurping the property of the Pandavas for the sake of his own sons. These are common affairs for a man grossly materialistic, and without knowledge of the spiritual force. He does not see how this can drag one from heaven to hell. By the grace of his younger brother Vidura, Dhritarashtra was enlightened and could see his grossly illusory engagements. And by such enlightenment, he was able to leave home for spiritual realization. Sri Naradadev was just foretelling the way of his spiritual progress in a place which was sanctified by the flow of the celestial Ganges. Drinking water only, without solid food, is also considered fasting. This is necessary for advancement of spiritual knowledge. A foolish man wants to be a cheap yogi without observing the regulative principles. A man who has no control over the tongue at first can hardly become a yogi. Yogi and bogi are two opposite terms. The bogi, or the merry man who eats and drinks, cannot be a yogi, for a yogi is never allowed to eat and drink unrestrictedly. We may note with profit how Dhritarashtra began his yoga system by drinking water only and sitting calmly in a place with a spiritual atmosphere, deeply absorbed in the thoughts of the Lord Hari, the personality of Godhead. Om Ajana Timarandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayarupa Gadamayam Dadati Swabadantikam. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jai. Okay, lots to talk about, particularly with the last purport and the translation of text 53, where the translation or the words are explaining the yoga process, drinking only water, etc., and being engaged in yoga by bathing 3 times a day. Morning, evening, and midday. And all of this regulation, if you like, is helping to control the mind. And the mind needs controlling. The mind is such a powerful thing. Actually, one thought on its power, it's kind of interesting, you know. I can immediately think right now, for instance, of being in India, as an example. I'm sitting here in Dublin, Ireland, and I can immediately think of being in India, in Delhi or Mumbai or Calcutta or wherever it might be. So the mind immediately transports you to those places. It can even transport you to places you've never been to. I can think now, for instance, of being, on the moon or whatever it may be. And in that sense, the mind immediately transfers you to that place. So the mind really is a super, super powerful tool like that. And when you have something so powerful, and generally speaking, because of the nature of the material world, it's a place of opposites, in all ways, actually. You can take anything you take in the material world, you have an opposite to it. So when you have something so powerful, like the mind, it can have, the mind can be used in an opposite way. It can be used for super positive things, but it can also be used for super negative things. But the thing about the mind, a little bit like if you take computers in the modern day and age, actually computers and then robotics, and they talk about having, or they're creating all the time robots to do different things. Now they can get them to talk and to dance and to do whatever they're getting them to do. Of course, the understanding is that those robots, they'll never necessarily have a mind of their own. and they can only be programmed by a human, and whatever that programming is the actual kind of independence like that. But the mind is different. Our minds are different. Our mind literally is independent. Actually, it's not independent because we can control it. But if we don't control it, it's literally can do its own thing and go crazy. And a nice verse in Bhagavad Gita, in the 6th chapter, is that the mind can either be our greatest friend or our worst enemy. And then it's explained that it's our greatest friend, or it's our worst enemy when we don't control it. And then when we don't control it, it's dictating to us. Oh, you have to eat this. Oh, you have to drink this. Oh, you have to smoke this. Oh, you have to, whatever the case may be. And that's what this verse and purport today is specifically talking about. It's about us controlling the mind and how to do that. That we're not just going to eat everything that's put in front of us or drink everything that's put in front of us or whatever the case may be. No, we're going to control the mind by being regulated. And in this case, you could argue it's quite an extreme form of regulation in terms of fasting, drinking only water. But the principle is that you're controlling the mind, because when we control the mind, then it's our greatest friend. So if we don't control it, it's our worst enemy. If we do control it, it's our greatest friend. So that's what it's kind of talking about. And of course, it's not required, by the way, that we have to do all these extreme forms of mind control, if you like, or enunciation, that we have to only drink water. We have the great concession that we can control the mind even better by honouring or eating prasadam, food, vegetarian food that's sanctified or offered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And then that actually helps us control the senses. So it doesn't have to be as austere as is presented today, but the principle is the same, that whatever we do, that we do it with a view that it's helping us to control our senses like that. And why? Because it's explained here in the purport about being attached to the material world, and Prabhupada gives a list, doesn't he, if I can get it quickly, talking about, family and he gives a list. Where was that list that he gave? Anyway, he talks, there it is, house, country, family, society, children, property, business, etc. All of these things are things we become attached to in the material world, and our focus is very much on the temporary nature of the world, and that generally centers around, first and foremost centers around ourselves, our own body, our own existence, but then it extends out to the family, etc., and country, and all of that kind of thing. But Prabhupada in the purport also is referring to them as he says, by material association and education, we learn to simply concentrate on flimsy things. Flimsy things. And flimsy things, our experience of them, Prabhupada, of course, is categorizing essentially everything in the material world as being flimsy. But then he says, but the yoga process is But yoga is the process of forgetting them all together. Just forgetting them all together. That's what the yoga process is there for. But I was just going to say, having problems with my camera, my apologies for that. I just may have to do this every once in a while. So flimsy things. So Prabhupada's categorizing everything in the material world in that sense as flimsy. But from our point of view, if you think in the material world, you go to the pound shops that they have. Almost by definition, what they sell in those places are flimsy because they're so cheap. I remember one time being stuck for a charger or something, and I went into a pound shop and I got myself a charger. Well, that charger lasted all of 72 hours or something, and then it wasn't working or burnt out or whatever the case may be. So flimsy things are ultimately useless, and Prabhupada, as I say, is categorizing essentially everything in the material world as being flimsy like that. And in one sense, again, on the point about the mind, you can see it from both angles. But, we can also categorize time as being the most flimsy of all, because we hold on to it in terms of it being very important and very precious. But it's flimsy because we can't control it, we can't stop it. And as the clock continues to tick, it's determining our existence in this material world. So time from the temporary point of view as it relates to the material world. is the flimsiest of all things. And of course, it's the thing throughout history that many people have wanted to control. Because they're clearly identifying that if they could control time, then they can control their existence in the material world, and they could ultimately, in that sense, prevent death. Of course, that's not possible, but that at least is the thought process like that. And time then becomes such an important thing also as it relates to our what we do, what we engage in like that. I think as someone famously said one time, that until you value yourself, now this is another important point because then we have to identify who we actually really are, but until we value ourselves, we won't value time. And until we value our time, we won't do anything with it. So that point about, valuing our time in this lifetime for people on the spiritual path, if you like, or people who are taking spiritual matters seriously, is that valuing our time, it should be relatively straightforward, given it's so limited. Time is so limited. We kind of find ourselves. I certainly find myself. Just on a daily basis, there never seems to be enough time for the things that you want to do. And of course, as every day pass, another famous song. Amazing how, as I've often said, how you retain all these lyrics from songs. But and just as I say that, I've forgotten what I was going to say, but it was about time and time passing. Yeah, we never have enough time in the day, and then of course as each day passes, that's one day closer to death, like that. So for people on the spiritual path, on the spiritual journey, that valuing our time, it should be relatively straightforward because of the fact that it is so limited. Now, what we do with that time, that of course is our personal choice. And reading from Srimad-Bhagavatam and all these wonderful spiritual literatures, they explain so clearly that there is nothing more valuable to do with our time than to engage it and use our time in activities that will benefit us eternally. And of course, according to Srimad-Bhagavatam, the best activity that we can engage in is devotional service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That can take many, many forms, but the core principle is that that's what we do with our time. All of our time. Now, that may not always be possible. We may not be in complete control of our minds and all these different factors that come into that. But in principle, we should be trying to engage in the service of Krishna in every single thing that we do. Srila Prabhupada once said about doing that during your waking hours, but then even when you sleep, that hopefully we can dream of Krishna, dream of Krishna's devotees. So even when we're sleeping, we're engaging in Krishna's service. And if we can achieve that, we'll set aside the sleeping part. That'd be wonderful too. But for the waking hours, if we can literally use our waking hours for engaging in devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and His pure devotees, our lives will be perfect. And then the time factor, ceases to kind of exist or be relevant. And at all times, to help us in trying to achieve that, we should remember that we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings who are currently having a human experience. And for me, at least, that's a really powerful thing to be remembering, that we get it the right way around. I even remember the first time, pretty much the first time that I came in contact with the devotees and discussing, spiritual subject matter, coming from a Christian background, a Catholic background. I remember thinking, the thought popping into my mind, that in one sense, all religious traditions are the same. They kind of do give the same message that we're eternal spiritual beings. We have an eternal Father, if you like, God, Krishna, Allah, Jehovah, whatever name is given to that eternal personality. So in one sense, the message is broadly the same, but the detail is very different. So I remember when I first, as I say, was associating or meeting devotees and discussing spiritual subject matter, I remember thinking then of my own upbringing, and it sort of became quite clear to me that one key difference between my Christian or Catholic upbringing and my Krishna conscious experience was that just like that point about we're not humans having a spiritual experience, but we are spiritual beings having a human experience. The whole focus from the Krishna conscious perspective was that we are eternal spiritual souls who just happen to have a body, whereas my kind of Catholic upbringing was more, no, this is who we are the body, and we have a soul somewhere. So it was just juxtaposed, or just turned around like that. So the more we can meditate on that point, that we are the eternal spirit soul, the body is a temporary covering, and it's not the other way around, that will greatly help us progressing in our spiritual life and our spiritual journey. So here today we're talking about Maharaj Yudhisthira was mourning, and to pacify the mourning Maharaj Yudhisthira, Narada, first of all, he spoke based on, he offered consoling words, as we all should do when someone is in mourning, because that's also a real part of our life. We're not impersonal, we're sentient beings, so we do get affected by people who we have had close relationships with when either those relationships break down or the person departs or whatever the case may be. We're affected by that. So Narada, he offered consoling words to Yudhisthira, but he also then focused on philosophy and the reality, if you like, of the situation. And Narada explained, he was explaining the yoga process as we've been discussing to Dhritarashtra, and that's what he got into, because that's what's going to help. So he was discussing that as opposed to what Prabhupada says somewhere today that I was reading. Prabhupada saying something like that he was discussing the real deal, for want of a better way of putting it, as opposed to modern so-called yogis and yoga systems who manifest magical feats. And it is kind of interesting, that we're so attracted by that. I remember as a kid growing up. I remember actually, where my father worked when I was a really young boy. They used to have a Christmas party at my father's work for the families and primarily for the children. So we would go along, and the highlight of that Christmas party every year, the big highlight was, they'd hire a magician. A magician would come in and start doing magical tricks, and the kids were just absolutely in awe of this. We were like sort of, 5, 6, 7, whatever, those kind of ages, and it's kind of like you hadn't a clue. You hadn't a clue that the ball they would throw up and then catch on their nose, had glue on it. Glue on the nose, glue on the ball, and whatever else they did. There was obviously an explanation for it, but as such young kids like that, it was just so fascinating and so intriguing. So this thing about magical feats and people doing magical things, and Prabhupada talks about it an awful lot in his books, because some people are empowered in that sense, but it's a very material empowerment that maybe they can make some gold appear, or they can do stuff like that. Of course in India you got the whole thing about the snake charmers, so all of these things, if we don't see them for what they are, yes, we become fascinated and distracted by them and taken away from what the real goal is and the real purpose of our lives are, and what we should do, the really important things that we should be focusing on. And Prabhupada often told a story, actually, connected to that, where a servant of a rich man came and told his master, if you like. A lot of these words aren't so used these days, but that was the system in days gone by, ancient times. So the servant, he came and he told his boss that he had seen an interesting yogi, and the yogi was in the river, and the servant was explaining that the yogi claimed that he could stay in that river right through the night. Now, just to give a little bit of context, right in the middle of the river, it was a deep river, wide river, deep river, and it was also in northern India, and it was also winter time. So actually, our instinctive thoughts about India is it's a very hot country, and it really is a hot country. But as you go to the north, particularly the northern part of India, and the kind of higher up you go. I remember I would go to West Bengal many times, and West Bengal is so hot, you know, and it's a real muggy heat. You know, it's not a dry heat. It's you know, in the other parts of India, some other parts of India, like Delhi, often, you know, you'll get a kind of dry heat near the desert, and that's much more tolerable. It's really hot, you know, it can be up to 40-45 degrees, so it's really hot. But the air is clear, you know, like that. But once you get into a muggy place where it's very humid and hot, and hot on top of that just becomes quite unbearable. So anyway, in West Bengal though, there's one of these, there's a place called Darjeeling, which I'm sure you've heard of. It's famous for tea and all that kind of thing. And that was one of what the British used to call their hill stations. So in summertime, all the, you know, the wealthy Brits would travel up to these hill stations, and it would be nice and cool. You know, it would be Darjeeling is kind of in the foothills of the Himalayas, like that. So it was very nice and cool. So as you go further north in India, particularly at winter time, and the higher up you go, it actually becomes quite cold. It can be really cold, actually. And of course the Himalayas themselves, that when people get up high enough, you know, they can die of hypothermia and all that kind of stuff. So so this yogi was claiming that he could stay in the middle of the river. This was winter time in northern India, like that. And the boss of this chap was kind of very he was impressed that anyone would be able to do that, but he really doubted that they would be able to do it. So he wanted to bet against the yogi being able to achieve that. So he did. He bet against that, and the yogi was aware that this bet was being placed and all that kind of thing. So anyway, night fell. And the yogi's in the river, right in the middle of it, just with his head above the water, so he can breathe. And the servant is left there, the king or the boss or whatever, the master. Excuse me. He goes home to have a nice sleep. Servant is left there to make sure that the yogi does actually stay in the water. And of course he does. He stays in the water, and he does everything that he was supposed to have done. So then the next morning, the servant reports this to his boss, that yes, he's done that, and the boss is about to pay out on the bet that he had lost, like that. But then he had a friend who was visiting, and the friend got to learn of what happened and what the story was and all that kind of stuff. And the friend says, "Oh well, let me go down and see the scene, see where it is and all that." So they went down to the river where the yogi was, and then the friend noticed, on the far side of the river, on one of the banks, high up on a hill, there was a temple. And on top of that temple, there was a big lamp, and that lamp was burning all night long. So this clever friend, said to the rich person who put the bet on, said to them that, "I bet what happened here is that yogi was meditating on that light on the top of that temple, and they were extracting from the distance, they were extracting the heat from that lamp, and that was what was able to keep them warm enough throughout the night so as that they could stay in the river." So when the rich man heard this, he decided, "Oh, that's cheating, you know, and I'm not going to pay out on the bet like that." So that's what happened, and the servant was thinking, he wasn't very happy about that. He thought that was a very convenient kind of argument as to not to honour the bet like that. So anyway, they went back to the house, and then it was time for breakfast, and the servant went into the kitchen to prepare breakfast for the king, his boss and his friend. And then after whatever it was, 20 minutes, half an hour, no breakfast came. So the owner of the house was kind of getting a bit frustrated, and he rang a bell to find out what was the delay with the breakfast. And this went on for 45 minutes, and an hour 15 minutes, and he was getting increasingly frustrated that breakfast was taking so long to come. So then he went into the kitchen himself, and in the kitchen, what the servant had done is that he, on the floor, he prepared a fire to cook the breakfast, but then the pot that he was cooking the breakfast in, or pots, he put them right up on the ceiling, sort of 3-4 meters away from from where the flame was. And when the owner came in and saw it, he says, "What are you doing? this is obviously why breakfast is taking so long. And of course the servant just said, yes, but you made the same argument, or you accepted the same argument, that this is how the yogi kept himself warm. So if it's good enough for the yogi to keep himself warm throughout the whole night in a cold river, then surely it's fine for you, you know, in your breakfast like that. And then the rich man, he could understand that the point that the servant was making, and you know, the main reason he was making that point was to emphasize that it was unfair and not very honorable that that his boss had not honored the bet as a result of this spurious argument about that. So Prabhupada tells that story in the context of the yoga process, that we can't, we have to follow the authorized process of yoga. And we can't follow, first off, we can't follow bogus processes, but even processes that are kind of connected to the yoga process. So in other words, there are different yoga things where you can make yourself very small, you can make yourself very big, you make yourself very light, you can make yourself very heavy, you know, there's different things, different things that you can do. But that the ultimate reason for yoga, and yoga means, you know, if you get into the epidemiology of the word, that it means, what the word yoga means is to relink or reconnect with the Supreme Person. So all of these other peripheral things, however magical they come across, and however, you know, sort of attracted we may be by them, particularly because we can't do them. If we can't do them, that's always a tendency as well. If somebody can do something that you can't do, it's like artists, you know, so an artist can take a sheet of paper, you know, and a pencil, and, you know, within 10 minutes they can have sketched, you know, your own portrait, and it looks really like you, you know, or whatever, like that. You know, you become impressed because you can't do it like that. So Prabhupada's point was, regardless of all of that, what we have to understand is, you know, what the real goal is, and the most important thing is like that. So for yoga, it's reconnecting with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It's not any of these kind of shows of like we've just been explaining now, and even that one actually is in one level quite an impressive one, what to speak of the less impressive ones, you know, that are there. So Prabhupada was saying that, you know, a foolish man wants to be a cheap yogi without observing the regulative principles. We always want to take shortcuts, you know. I mean, how many times I think of that, you know, and I will say to Krishna sometimes, you know, gosh, Krishna, why do you make it so hard, you know? I understand the principle, I understand that, you know, that I'm an eternal spirit soul, I understand I can never be happy in the material world, I understand that I need to serve you in order to reconnect and you know, to hopefully go back to the spiritual world, etc., where I won't be affected by birth, death, old age and disease and all of these different things. But then, you know, and of course, you know, it's hard because we have to, if you like, prove our sincerity, for want of a better way of putting it, you know, that we're really determined to give up our material attachments like family, friends, you know, business, etc., all these different things. So we have to, you know, we have to prove that we're really sincere that we want to do that. But still, you know, it doesn't stop the mind from thinking sometimes, you know, oh gosh, you know, Krishna, could it not just be a little bit easier like that? And, you know, there's so many different references, you know, along these lines that Prabhupada has shared with us, that, you know, a man who, you know, first cannot control his tongue cannot become a yogi. That was actually referenced today, right, in what we read. Let's read that. For a yogi, anyway, he talks about being a bogey, wasn't it? A foolish man wants to be a cheap yogi without observing the regulative principles. A man who has no control over the tongue, can hardly become a yogi. Yogi and bogey are two opposite terms. The bogey, or the merry man who eats and drinks, cannot be a yogi, for a yogi is never allowed to eat and drink unrestrictedly. So the bogey, and bogey comes from the word boga actually, and boga means something material that we use for our enjoyment like that. And that's why when we prepare when we prepare vegetarian food, it's called boga. Prior to it being offered to Krishna, it's called boga, and that's where this word bogey is coming from. And if we eat bhoga, we become a bhogi. So we offer it to Krishna like that, and then, as I said earlier, that helps us to eating the bhoga is a obstacle to us advancing on the spiritual path. But offering it to Krishna and then honouring it as Krishna's prasadam or Krishna's mercy, then that is actually, something that helps us on the spiritual path like that. And of course, there's one famous verse in the Nectar of Instruction, the very first verse, Vacho Vegam Manasa Kroda Vegam, and it's explaining that somebody who has learned to control, actually the tongue, the belly and the genitals, they're in a straight line like that, and it all starts with the tongue, controlling the tongue. And there are two functions of the tongue. One is that it tastes, it helps in the eating process, and you can taste food through the tongue. And the other thing with the tongue, of course, like I've been doing for the last 45 minutes, is you use it to talk like that. So Prabhupada explained many, many times that the best thing to do with the tongue is, for those two things, the two functions of the tongue, is always eat Krishna prasadam. Always eat Krishna prasadam, and always speak about Krishna conscious philosophy, the pastimes of Krishna, etc. If we do those two things, always eat Krishna prasadam, never put anything else in our mouth that isn't either offered to Krishna, or what to speak of something that's not offerable even to Krishna like that, but we always put prasadam or sanctified vegetarian foodstuffs that have been offered to Krishna. That's the only thing that goes into our mouths. And the only thing that comes out of our mouths in terms of words is talking about Krishna and the Krishna conscious philosophy. Then we are effectively Vacho Vegam Manasa Kroda Vegam, that we have controlled the tongue. And once we control the tongue, we automatically are controlling the belly, and then automatically controlling the genitals. So sometimes we think controlling the genitals is the hardest part, because sex life is such a powerful attraction and a powerful force in the material world, a driver, if you like, of the material world. And actually we know that, Prabhupada often said, actually, the only reason that the material world exists, and the only reason that the material world continues, the only reason that the material world keeps spinning, is due to two things: money and sex. They're the two kind of big factors involved like that. But as I say, if we can control the tongue, we will automatically control the genitals. And then once we do that, the English translation of that verse from the Nectar Instruction is that a sober person, or a person who can tolerate the urge to speak, other than, of course, speaking about Krishna, then if we have urges to speak about Krishna, that's glorious. But the urge to speak on relative things, can control that urge. The mind's demands, like we talked earlier about the mind demanding us to eat this, drink this, speak this, touch this, whatever it may be. So a person who can tolerate the urge to speak, the mind's demands, the actions of anger, and the urges of the tongue, the belly, and the genitals, they're qualified to lead the world and to bring the whole world onto the path of Krishna consciousness like that. So it's a very, very powerful, and it's very scientific. That's the other thing. Often, again, in my own life, growing up, and even today, that's the argument so many times is put forward, that religion is dogmatic, or it's sentimental, and all of these kind of things. And in many respects, I wouldn't argue that there isn't any truth to that. But the Krishna conscious process is a scientific process. It's based on science, and that if you engage in the process correctly and don't look for cheap alternatives like we've been discussing today, you engage in the process properly, you learn to control the tongue, control the senses, and all of those things, that then you become liberated, you become free from the material world like that. So it's a very scientific process, and if we follow that process, we will be successful. Okay, I think I'll stop there. A little bit more than 45 minutes, I think, which I think is a good time. We all have, as we were talking earlier, busy lives. Always good to get the day off, though, with some Krishna Katha, or some discussion around Krishna. So I hope that I've been able to help with that today, and that you have a good day, whatever you're doing. But remember to try to, whatever you're doing, to always do it at least with the consciousness of Krishna behind it. If it's not directly related, at least that you're doing it with that consciousness like that. And as I say, that will make our lives successful and deliver us, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, from the greatest type of fear. And the greatest type of fear is death and rebirth, reincarnation on the wheel of samsara. Thank you all very much. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.